So today we are going to be talking, we're going to be covering quite a bit from a very happy release of our new book with University of Amsterdam Press that distinguished Professor Larissa Hjorth is holding up, Digital Media Practices in Households, Kinship Through Data. I will quickly introduce Larissa. Larissa is a digital ethnographer. She's an artist. She's also the director of the Design and Creative Practice platform at RMIT University in Melbourne. She's a visiting professor at the Center for Co-Design at Osaka University in Japan. We also have with us distinguished Professor Sarah Pink, who is the director of the Emerging Technologies Lab at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. She is the visiting professor at Halmstad University in Sweden and at Loughborough University in the UK, and guest professor at the Free University of Berlin in Germany. And finally, we also have Professor Heather Horst, who was with us in MECO for a few years, but has now gone on to bigger and brighter things and left us all behind at Western Sydney University, where she is the director of the Institute for Culture and Society. I have not read out any of their publications or books because we would take up the next hour. So we're going to talk about this book today. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Larissa.
Thank you very much. Okay, now I've just got to warn people, my internet's really bad, so I've had to come down to the dining table. So we could expect a kid bomb at any point, but I feel it kind of is, given that we're looking at intergenerational relationships in media, I feel it's kind of fitting. Okay. So firstly, Wamajika, because I would like to acknowledge that as we gather here from predominantly Melbourne and Sydney, I think, we are on unceded lands, and I respectfully acknowledge the elders past, present and future. So digital media households is a result of an Australian Research Council linkage with Intel, KL and Fudan University. I'd like to acknowledge all the wonderful contributions made from our Japanese and Chinese colleagues, Kana Hachi, Fumi Kato and Boha Zhu. In our collaborative cross-cultural fieldwork in Japan, China and Australia, we followed 12 households over 3 years and found many quotidian intergenerational forms of care at a distance, from informal digital health apps to more complex ways of sharing and caring in and through media. These we called digital kinship. So during the pandemic, we've seen digital kinship being amplified in the face of restrictions and lockdown. And so for those that are from Melbourne, we've had we have had 6 months of lockdown. So we're kind of almost gleeful at the moment that we can run out and, you know, do things without a mask. But many of us have been unable to see our loved ones, and the only way to be connected is through the digital. In turn, the inequalities have been heightened. The pandemic has compelled us to rethink the connection between digital literacy, access, and social inclusion across the generations. So as an entanglement between digital, social, material, and cultural, digital kinship puts the intergenerational informal care and intimacy at the centre of discussion. Digital kinship, as my colleague Heather will elaborate, is about the different ways generations deploy media in their everyday to connect and care. Understanding digital kinship involves engaging with concepts such as care at a distance, digital wayfaring, and friendly surveillance. So now I just want to turn to two fieldwork stories to show rather than tell. So when we meet 86-year-old widower, Machiko, she has been just introduced to Pokemon Go by her grandson, Haru. For those uninitiated, augmented reality AR game Pokemon Go overlays physical sites with the digital story, creating new ways of seeing and moving through familiar spaces. In 2016, all that time ago, it was a global phenomenon which brought together decades of AR experimentation into the mainstream. 3 years later, by 2019, Pokemon Go had become mundane media. That is, an application increasingly used by adults, often via intergenerational means, for social inclusion and exercise. Machiko is indicative of this phenomenon. So after being introduced by her grandson, Machiko would each morning get up and pull on her sneakers and hit the streets in search of Pokespots and friendly Pokemon players. Pokemon Go allowed Machiko to reinvent her everyday city through AR, overlaying physical cartographies and also being an avenue for social inclusion. In the second iteration of Pokemon Go, social inclusion in physical places became intrinsic for fighting monsters in the gym. By gamifying social connection as part of play, Pokemon Go has become an example of how old apps can be reinvented for digital inclusion and informal digital health across the generations. Through play, intergenerational sociality can be enhanced, that is, digital kingship. So now I'll turn to 32-year-old flight attendant Rika, who lives alone in a flat just a stone's throw away from her 72-year-old mother, another Machiko. There's only 2 Machikos in the book, just in case you were wondering. While traditionally families in Japan lived together in bygone times, now it's common for them to live apart. It is the smartphone that has helped navigate a care at a distance, that is, allowing moments of ambient intimacy, and friendly surveillance. Dutch anthropologist Jeanette Pauls explored the notion of care at a distance in formal palliative telehealth contexts, in which she argued that technology only works when used in unison and not replacing face-to-face care. She argued against the digital health panacea of technology as the silver bullet. Her work around telecare is indeed prescient, given the pandemic's recalibration of health towards the digital. So we take Paul's notion and apply it to informal settings and situations, that is, articulating the often invisible and tacit forms of intergenerational care at a distance. This informal care is crucial to digital kingship. Returning to Rika, like many of her generation, she grew up with a mobile, or what is called the keitai. Her first keitai was bought for her when she was 10 years old as a form of personal security, a type of social surveillance response in response to the growing aura of crime, what Misha Matsuka called mum in the pocket. As the keitai has grown and transformed into the smartphone, so too has the digital rhythms of Rika and her mother's relationship in and through the digital co-presence. While first generation keitai were more about parents watching children, the smartphone has developed different avenues for horizontal reciprocal social intergenerational watching. That is, parents ambulantly watching their grandparents, parents watching children, and so on. Digital media reflects informal notions of what is called nimamuro. That is a type of watching, a Japanese notion of watching that involves care towards someone's safety. For Rika, who is often overseas for work, the use of social media line to keep a friendly eye on her elderly mother has been crucial in providing care at a distance. And by the end of the fieldwork, Rika herself becomes a mother. Again, digital media is recalibrated by the different familiar rhythms, that is digital kingship. So these 2 vignettes taken from Japanese fieldwork demonstrate the numerous ways in which digital media play a role in intergenerational digital kingship, digital wayfaring, tactile ethnography, and friendly surveillance. These concepts we will explore this afternoon. So now I'm going to hand to the brilliant Heather to outline digital kingship and also some key points about doing cross-cultural ethnography. Thank you.
Thanks, Larissa. It's always fun to actually hear your colleagues talk about the book after sitting in the writing and Google Docs and stuff. So it's actually really fun to hear about the project and about the kind of Japanese field work that really, I think, Larissa, you were the most sort of in touch with, because it was such a distributed team. So I want to talk a bit about digital kinship in particular. And one of the aspects of this project that I was really excited about as we were sort of developing it and then eventually got funded for it was really this sort of the way in which locative, mobile, and social media really made visible new forms of kinship that are emerging. So for those of us who are geeky anthropologists in the room, my apologies, but I just wanted to kind of recap. I mean, kinship is, what's important about kinship, and particularly throughout this book, is that it's one of these concepts that's been really foundational to the discipline of anthropology. And it's one that we've really used to understand the ways in which social groups are formed. how they define relatedness, as well as the rights and obligations that people have to each other as a result of being defined as kin or family. So these rights and obligations often play themselves out in the everyday interactions between people, and what counts as kin and what counts as sort of different forms of relatedness. Janet Karsten has written a lot of work on this, really varies across different cultural contexts. So for examples in countries where I've worked, such as Jamaica, there's a broader recognition of family outside of the nuclear unit, where third, fourth, and fifth cousins are actually very meaningful relationships. And there are also different norms around the role of people like aunties in caring for children, for example. It's not unusual for Jamaican and West Indian families to pay school fees or even take over primary caring responsibilities. As Nancy Munn and many others have noted, in places like Papua New Guinea, the recognition of kinship, relatedness, and connectedness might mean that when a family member runs into you, they actually have the right to ask you, to give you your short, to say, can I have your short? Can I have your mobile phone? And if they are actually in the right relationship to you, if they're your one talk, you might actually be obligated to actually give that to them. You don't really have the option to say no. So that the point of this is really that the rules and structures of kinship and relatedness and the meanings and practices that really enliven them actually really matter. So despite these kind of long established practices and structures of kinship that I've been kind of hinting at in the kind of vestiges of anthropology, we're also very aware in this project that, and really at the outset, that kinship and relatedness are really changing in very subtle, but also in not very subtle ways. So for example, in our Australian case studies, we actually focus upon two different kinds of populations of what you might think of as kind of non-dominant Australian family groups. First generation and second generation transnational migrant families, as well as gay, lesbian, bi, and transgender families. And we did this to really explore the emergence of the different or new forms of relatedness that are coming out through digital media. And we could have just as easily focused our attention upon kinship and relatedness amongst the growing population of single person households, which is really a big trend in Australia. In the families we studied in Shanghai, the families had been impacted by China's one-child policy, where there were actually very few people who had siblings to create kind of peer-level generational connection to. And this obviously had implications for notions of rights and obligations to people like parents and children. In Tokyo, as you've been hearing about a bit, the growth in the older population has really shaped how families operate and the kinds of support that come from children, siblings, and grandchildren, but also peer networks of older people, again, might be siblings, but also friends in sort of informal social networks. So despite these very different urban contexts, what the concept of digital kinship really allowed us to do was to reflect upon the broader debates about the changing practices of being family, as well as some of the continuities. Through the lens of digital media, we could see how practices of relatedness and kinship move in and out of online and offline spaces, across and within different platforms, and across and within different families. And what we ultimately found, and you'll see this actually in the structure of the book, is that doing kinship or family are shaped really by four factors. The first one is really about digital platforms. Families use specific digital platforms to visualize, represent, and make evident forms of relationships. So for many Australian transnational families we study, for example, WhatsApp became an important archive of the family. But in Japan and the Japanese social media platform Line was used for practices such as wishing people happy birthdays or giving digital gifts. Second, kinship was really reproduced through forms of play over digital platforms, as Larissa was talking about at the very outset of her talk. It was common in many families to spend time online, when not together, playing small word games, sending memes and jokes. And in Shanghai, we saw a number of WeChat stickers, for example, being circulated in Shanghai families. So the informal spaces of being together and sharing in what felt like informal time, hanging around together, or what Ito and Akabe once described in the context of Japan as creating a sense of full-time intimate community, became really important in kind of doing or creating and reproducing notions of family. A third element that we saw is that people really use digital and mobile media to visualize themselves as a family. So in our Melbourne case studies, a number of families spent time organizing and sharing photos from family events in their digital devices. And they did things like share collages with others in the family through their WhatsApp groups. Visualization also included the creation of subgroups in WhatsApp groups, for example, WhatsApp groups that made distinctions between different relationships in the family. So there are things that you can say to your cousin that you can't say to your auntie, for example. And so you might have different groups for these things. And finally, people really use digital media to engage in what's described in this last section of the book as co-futuring. And these included, kind of planning points and times where you might be able to get together. I'm guessing this is happening quite a bit in Melbourne. Christmas is coming, family reunions, trips, weddings, etc. But also exchanging more mundane things such as recipes for meals, pictures of outfits you might wear to a place, plants growing in your yard to coordinate, and really just discussing family planning and other activities. But I think the point that I want to end with is that in all of these, data was really the currency through which these forms of connection and care, as you'll continue to hear about, really emerged. And they allowed people to further develop their stories, memories, and connections that constitute contemporary digital kinship. So I will turn it over, I believe, now to Jolynna.
Thank you very much, Heather. I would like to talk a little bit about what we did in Melbourne. We conducted the fieldwork in Melbourne a few years ago now. So this was across 2015 and 2016 with 12 families here. And we visited them once in 2015 and again in 2016. And these visits were for quite an extended period of time. So I was the fieldwork leader for the Melbourne field site, and we had two other fieldwork leaders in the Tokyo and the Shanghai field sites. So in 2015, I worked very closely with with Sarah, who was leading and was developing some of the more innovative methods that we were using. And then I worked with Heather quite closely in 2016 for the follow-up visits. So to work with each of the 12 families in Tokyo, Shanghai, and Melbourne, we drew on ethnography, which most typically uses participant observation. Please excuse me again for the anthropologists in the room who we always talk about kinship and ethnography, but for those of you who might not be so familiar, I'll try to skim over just very quickly. So ethnography typically uses participant observation, and participant observation allows for unexpected insights and naturally occurring moments to emerge. The data that emerges from these sorts of methods would often remain hidden, overlooked, and they emerge from the reality of people's ordinary lives, their practices, their sense of identity, their norms, the views that are taken for granted. Of course, generally, it's not feasible to do long-term immersive fieldwork, especially within households in a family study. So ethnographic methods have become increasingly used for other kinds of interdisciplinary study. For the themes that we were interested in with media, ethnography reveals how people make sense of media in their everyday lives, as well as their usage. What does media enable? What practices emerge? What meanings are made from media usage? How does it spill into other aspects of their lives? How does it spill into their sense of self, their emotional and intellectual experiences, and the social geographies that emerge from as an extension of that? So for example, when people watch TV in their homes or when they're out in the cinema, they don't necessarily think of themselves as part of a wider audience that they may not identify with those fellow audience members in the same way. So it's difficult to observe these kinds of activities directly, especially when it comes to using mobile media, which is often used in points of transit or in very immersive senses of privacy. An observation is likely to reveal the context of use, but not necessarily its experience. Interviews provide participants narratives about what they do with their devices, yet they don't necessarily bring these insights into how these play out experientially. So the ethnographic techniques helped us to engage with people's intimate experiences and familial rhythms of everyday life and uses beyond, everyday life beyond the uses of mobile media. So in this very brief explanation, I'm referring here mostly to our article that was led by Sarah, Tactile Digital Ethnography, Researching Mobile Media Through the Hand, in the journal Mobile Media and Communication that came out a few years ago, and also chapter 1 of the book, which outlines some of the ways we drew on these methods derived from ethnography and how we try to follow and observe mobile and locative media in everyday life. and the feelings and experiences of co-presence, social media socialities, play and leisure. So in 2015, in the second phase of the research, we conducted household visits that involved video recorded demonstrations or reenactments of participants' uses of their devices and apps. We conducted tours of their homes to explore where and how individuals use their devices. And the reenactments involved participants demonstrating their embodied ways of knowing by showing us what they usually do while verbally reflecting on these activities. They were not intended to be repeats of actual events, but instead were ways of collaborating with our research participants to produce an understanding of the normally unspoken ways of knowing performed in these kind of usage environments. We asked participants to show us a few activities, so scenarios of use. We got them to draw a day in the life and sort of map out their homes and where their devices are located. They would walk us through their homes and show us where they would use devices and for what kinds of activities in their everyday routines. Ideally, we'd ask them to walk us through the day before, so it's kind of immediate for them. We did a similar kind of walkthrough or tour with their apps while they talked us through the images and texts and the apps that they used and why they use them. So in particular, the approach of tactile ethnography involved engaging with participants while they were scrolling through their phone, something that's usually done habitually and alone and reveals a lot more about intimacy and privacy while we're kind of there while they're going through the sort of haptic motions of their devices with us. Putting one's finger on the phone on the screen doesn't just open apps, but it invokes feelings of connection with people, experiences and activities. And we found that when people picked up their phones, they started going through things in their phones, their explanations and the people, the experiences connected with them, connected with their phones, just became a lot more alive. They just became much more lively in their explanation of experiences to us. In the third phase, in 2016, we developed a set of semi-structured interviews and object-led interviews that was a follow-up from the year before. So how did they update their devices? Could they show us the new devices in relation to their old devices? How they spoke about the new devices, the sense of excitement or disappointment or challenges that came with replacing or upgrading devices. We also sat down with members of the household and asked them to show us how and where they stored their digital data. So as Heather explained, one of the things that we focused on in that second phase of research was visuality and visual images and how they are circulated between and between family members and within families, and how this creates a sense of familyhood. We were also particularly interested in how people stored, shared, and shedded data more generally. We wanted to know how the ways in which that people sift and sort through data, how they store them, on what devices, and their strategies to access them into the future, which also revealed how they thought about not only digital memory and the devices associated with digital memory, but family memory as well, family memory of individuals and within particular family relationships. We found that the interplay between these material infrastructure of digital devices and immaterial infrastructures of relationships and emotional geographies shapes the nature of data storage, circulation, and meaning making within the home by drawing attention to the social relationships and emotional connections, individual and collective imaginations, and the forms of obligation that shape how they experience and produce digital data. So I'll finish it there. Those were a couple of the main themes from the 2 phases of research, and I'll turn it over to Sarah.
So yeah, it's great to hear all of my colleagues talk about the work and to kind of to build up as well, so that I'm now kind of presenting with some kind of knowledge of what everybody else has said. And I'm going to talk about digital wayfaring and also a little bit about the kind of conceptual level that represents within the project as well. So the concept of wayfaring comes from Tim Ingold's work, where he compares what he calls wayfaring and transport, and sees transport as being very much the idea of going somewhere kind of a straight line, much more kind of clinical and cold kind of way of getting from one place to another, and then sees wayfaring as something which is much more about that sensorial and intuitive kind of meandering process through which we move through an environment and we encounter different circumstances, people, things, and configurations as we move through. So it's a very processual idea, and it's very much about the way that we experience and sense the world as we move through it. Now that sounds rather abstract, and it is. And it's also a concept that I think is much more kind of associated with a non-digital world. Ingold doesn't really write about technology in the sense of the digital very much at all. But the interesting thing about wayfaring is that if we think about it in relation to mobile media, then it kind of opens up a whole new way of actually understanding the way we move through the world with digital media and technologies. And mobile media, obviously, and locative media, are a fantastic technology through a device through which to actually kind of understand how then our relationship as mobile beings moving through or wayfaring through a world actually takes place in a way that brings together the digital, the technological, media content, and the material and the physical environment at the same time. How do those kind of sensorial experiences of moving through the world and material, physical world also become part of that experience of using digital technology? So Jolynna was just talking about the tactile kind of ethnography and digital ethnography technique, which is very much part of this process as well. We feel our way through the world, but we also feel our way through our devices as we use them. Touch is absolutely central, as is vision and the other senses, but there's a very kind of sensorial experiential dimension to the way in which we actually use digital mobile media in our lives. And that, of course, is also part of the way in which we experience digital kinship and digital intimacy. So the idea of thinking through digital wayfaring then actually helps me in particular, I think, to think about how we actually move through the world with our technologies, how we live in this kind of on the go in a mobile world, and how we're actually not just part of a physical world, not just part of a digital world. And very important in our project was not to separate the physical and digital worlds, but to actually see them as part of the same thing, and to see our participants then kind of navigating their way through the physical world in relation to the digital world. So the way in which, for example, our participants kept in contact with their families, or people, members of their families who cared for them, or were or concerned about where they were when they were out. So this kind of knowing, sharing, engaging with other people, engaging with the family, was actually articulated through what we might call this kind of mode of digital wayfaring, being part of a digital world and context and set of relationships, while also being part of a material world and context and set of relationships. So for me, that was one of the kind of the key ways of thinking about it. And I think that the examples that Heather and Larissa and Jolynna have been talking about have really kind of also showed how that kind of digital wayfaring is played out in people's real lives. So Heather was talking about the examples of taking pictures of plants and sharing them with family. And I remember actually one of the specific home visits where we talked about that. I think Jolynna was with me as well when we were looking at the photos of the plants which had been taken. They were being shown to us on an iPad, and those are photos in the very garden that we could also see and experience kind of materially as well. And then we knew that those photos were going overseas to other family members. And so this whole kind of way of moving through a garden, taking pictures, wayfaring your way through a world, a small local world of your garden with your plants, could then actually be shown to researchers, but also sent to your family so they could experience it in another way as well, and also accompany you as you actually kind of, as you share and imagine what it was like, because they'd probably been and visited and been in that garden as well. So those relationships of kind of sharing sensory experience and knowing and wayfaring were really, really fundamental to our kind of understanding of the closeness and the sensoriality and the feelings, the affect of those relationships that people were engaging in online and in face-to-face contexts. They're very much part of what we could talk about as the entanglements of everyday life, and the way in which digital media researchers have often talked, and social scientists talk about the mess of everyday life, and the digital mess of the home. And the kind of way that things become entangled in this kind of mess, and they're never really, they're inextricable from each other. And I think our project showed so much about how that played out in real everyday life situations, and the effective emotional caring dimensions that were part of that I know Larissa's going to talk about more in a bit. So what I wanted to end by just commenting on, because I think for me, you know, engaging this, and Larissa and I developed this concept of digital wayfaring in previous work as well, and it fitted so well to this project as well and helps to develop it further. And for me, actually working at this conceptual level with digital wayfaring, and also the concept of digital kinship that Heather was talking about, but also the concept of digital intimacy that I know that Larissa's done a lot of work on in the past as well, and that Larissa mentioned too. Working at that conceptual level for me, I think, is also one of the key things that this book brings to our kind of community of researchers, and also is interesting for us because the concepts have come from existing thinking and ideas. They've come into this book. The ethnographic work and development we've done within this book has enabled us to advance them further and to really consolidate them. But they also travel forward into other projects as well. And it makes me, one of the projects I'm working on at the moment, which is about how child protection social workers have used digital media as part of their work during the COVID pandemic in the UK. It's been fascinating for me to actually bring some of those concepts to that project, to a field of research where media studies and media anthropology, digital anthropology concepts are so rarely employed and engaged at all. And to see how they play out in that kind of situation, for me, is really significant, because the work that we've done in this project is actually enabling me to bring those concepts to an applied project, which is very much could be about life and death and danger for people. So I think that, you know, what we've really been able to create something important in this project and to take it forward in new work as well. And I think I'll stop there just to say that one project, it doesn't just end in a book. The life of the project, the life of the concepts and the ethnography goes forward into new projects, while also our research participants' lives are all still going forward as well. So that's the kind of the dynamic of the work that really excites me. And I'll hand over to Larissa now, and hope I haven't spoken for too long.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks so much. So I'm now going to talk about friendly surveillance. So I'm just looking at the list of people here, and there's so many people I just want to go hello to, but, you know, got to stay on focus, stay on track. So most of the people here will be familiar with the kind of existing literature around kind of surveillance, which takes those more kind of hierarchical traditional models. But what we found in the field work was much more of these more kind of what has been talked about as social or horizontal surveillance. And so I just want to now return back to the vignettes because I just want to kind of elicit some of that kind of discussion around that. So as we saw in the two that I began with, and it was like I kind of like was thinking, which ones am I going to use? Which one am I going to use? So I just focused on the two Japan ones because I think they talk about the kind of some of the spectrums that we're seeing. But vignettes really do kind of highlight the kind of intergenerational care at a distance, and while also reflecting the kind of cultural mores. And this is particularly what Heather was talking about in terms of the work of digital kinship and kinship in more general, about thinking about continuities rather than disruption, which, you know, you see a lot of that rhetoric in digital media politics. So as we know, like after the disaster of the Fukushima, known as 3/11, Japan has seen the rise of a lot of watching mobile apps that allow families and loved ones to keep track of each other in ways that are non-invasive and are caring. Apps for older adults while they are driving, and also apps to keep track on people with early onset of dementia are indicative of these horizontal ways of watching. And as we know, like when we're looking at aging populations, one of the kind of key things in Australia, we live in quite an ageist society, but ways in which to give older adults integrity is really to allow them to have autonomy. And so this idea of having a kind of watching app, which doesn't actually, doesn't kind of elicit a very hierarchical model of watching, is really important in that respect and care. So while debates about data valence in locations such as Japan, such as China, have developed, some really kind of dark dimensions about governmental control, in Japan we can see examples of data valence which might be conceptualized as caring. Often datification is conflated with data valence, that is the watching of people through data. These processes are often described as exploitative and hierarchical, and Deborah Lupton's written a lot of wonderful stuff in this area. And as we've seen in our field work, and Deborah's work has really highlighted that, datification and data valence can also be thought about conceptually as creative and participatory. That is, they can be, rather than being seen as exploitative, they can be used to care. So in those two vignettes that I showed, we saw two examples of friendly social surveillance. That is, an understanding of surveillance as that involves a sense of care and an ethics of care. Rather than those top-down models of data valence that receive high attention in internet studies, digital technologies directed at supporting and facilitating care can often be used in participatory ways that as part of intimate relationships. Datification and data valence technologies can offer opportunities for people to engage in practices that will improve health and well-being, important as we move towards societies with increasingly ageing populations. And we see this at the end of the book when we go and revisit the families a year later to think about that kind of co-futuring exercise. These digitalized modes of communication allow for generated mediated co-presence and maintaining intimate familial connections in the face of geographic separation. Further, they can help people engage in self-care when family members are not physically present. So through our field work, we explored these intergenerational practices in the form of digital kinship that reflected our changing and yet continuing notions of care in a datified world. So I just want to conclude that, because I think we're going to have a conclusion and then we're going to break. Is that right? We're going to do a little bit of breaking and doing that exercise thing and then coming back for question time. Is that right? So, so in conclusion, we've talked about concepts such as digital wayfaring, friendly surveillance and digital kingship, and techniques like tactile ethnography to curate the complex and contesting intergenerational and cross-cultural practices. We argue for a model that explores intergenerational experiences over time as part of broader continuities. Digital kingship is about the different ways generations deploy data in their everyday life to connect and care at a distance. And as we've seen during the pandemic, the role of the digital for intergenerational care and connection is crucial. Our book seeks to contribute to this important phenomena. So thank you.
There we go. Thank you so much, Amanda. Why were those three countries picked?
Great question. That's an awesome question. Yes, and we had a lot of, when we were putting the linkage application in, we had a lot of robust discussion about that. I mean, I think, I've done quite a bit of work in Japan and China, and I had some colleagues that were doing some really interesting work, and we were having the kind of conversation, and they had, one of them, for example, Fumi, came to Dirk, so we were once all together. This is why I'm kind of smiling very sentimentally at everyone, because we were all at RMIT in Dirk, and a lot of international scholars came there, and one of them was Fumi, who was part of the project. And so I think it was trying, I mean, it is like these projects, they involve a lot of deep relationships, a lot of deep trust, and you kind of build them up over time. And so there was already existing relationships there, and there was a kind of coming together of an interest. And the project was initially looking at locative media. And then when we started to kind of get into the kind of field, we worked out that it was actually really hard to get at locative media just by itself, and that it actually need to be contextualized. And we realized that a lot of the discussions around locative media were very much not necessarily putting them in context. So we really, so the reason why we in the application, the linkage application, we chose Tokyo, Shanghai and Melbourne because they have very, very distinct histories in terms of locative media. And so they provided a lot of interesting comparison. And yet, as we saw over the 3 years, they actually ended up coming together and showing a lot of similarities. So that was kind of really interesting. So thank you, Amanda. Fantastic question.
Heather, do you have anything to add about the context of the NBN, which was quite significant in 2016?
Yeah, I mean, I think we, one of the things, and I think it actually even came in one of our reviews, was like, Shanghai, Tokyo, and Melbourne. Those aren't exactly on the same sort of scale of things, but we were really looking at, there have been some really fantastic studies, done, now I'm losing the names of who done it, but I think many of us know, Mike Arnold, et cetera, that had really been looking at the impact of the NBN and the kind of potential of that to kind of shift practices around that. But I think also one of the things that's interesting about Melbourne and maybe even Australia compared to other sites in the world that you can imagine is the kind of focus on mobile. It is a place where prepaid phone, actually happens, in contrast to a lot of places in the US and Europe, where, there is a kind of mobile phone kind of culture. So in that sense, we felt that there were some interesting kind of developments, and again, as I pointed to, there was the sort of technological elements, but also some of the really interesting family dynamics that really a focus on a site like Melbourne really enabled us to kind of get at in an in-depth way. We didn't feel the need to be as kind of representative, in terms of representing all the different kinds of families, and wasn't a kind of sociologically driven project where we had to have different things. We wanted to really drill down with these more specific case studies, and so working in Melbourne enabled us to do that. Plus we were all in Melbourne, so it made lots of sense for lots of other reasons. So we had deep connections.
Do you have something to add, Sarah? Go ahead.
Yeah, I also think that there's something quite important about decentering, some of the debate away from the US and Europe and the UK. So much research is kind of centered on those, and academic debate has been centered on those contexts, and actually bringing into focus the places where we've been doing our research. For me, it's just really, really important. And, I think you can learn so much more from this kind of focus than just asking the same questions of the same places again and again. So for me, I think that was very kind of significant to be able to do that, and also for us to be able to use our kind of the different kind of modes of expertise that we all brought to the project as co-investigators as well.
Melbourne had quite a distinct context for transnational families. So the patterns of migration to Melbourne were quite different, say, to Tokyo, where Rika was one of the examples of where she worked sort of outbound, but Tokyo is quite different in terms of like inbound migration. And I had just come off the back of quite a big comparative project where transnational migration was a large element. So that was the interest that I also had in that. Jonathan has a question, and then Penny has a question, and then Svet has a question. So Jonathan says, I really liked the upended approach towards friendly surveillance. This is to counter the general take on surveillance as being a bad thing. Beyond family, how do you see this concept being applied more broadly for shared benefit? I think Larissa has done quite a bit of work on this, so I'll throw it to Larissa first.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Jonathan. Hello. Thanks. There's been some fantastic work on the kind of more social surveillance, like Alice Marwick's, and also Tamara Lever's work around intimate surveillance. So we're all kind of speaking to that kind of literature. In particular, I'm thinking through this study, we did a article on where we looked at, so you're saying beyond the family, we looked at same-sex relationships and the use of digital media for surveillance. So it was this idea that using, you know, everything from like the Stravas, etc. Apps to be able to, or having, you know, a partner having a kind of logged in at the same time, like logged in account where they share that account, so that they're actually able to, you know, kind of keep an eye on each other. And I think particularly that piece we wrote in response to Melbourne, where women and the use of locative media have been quite important around ideas of safety and security. And we've had cases where you know, murders, for example, when police have used the digital, the mobile tracking to be able to find the murderer, etc. You know, so there's Jill, I'm just trying to think her surname. You know, the big the ABC reporter that got killed, and that really brought in that the need for mobile media, you know, in terms of this kind of caring, how it can actually. Oh, thanks for putting the article in there. How it can actually be used to help reinforce a sense of safety and security, which is a very gendered thing. We also, I mean, it's a generational thing and it's a gender thing, but so in that particular study, we really focused on some of the findings that we had in Melbourne through our kind of same-sex participants. And we're really kind of fascinating fleshing out some of these more kind of nuanced, mundane ways that it can be used in ways really to care. And I think, yeah, thank you. That's Jill Megger. Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else want to say anything about this kind of surveillance dimension? I would also just like to say that another concept, careful surveillance, which I kind of had developed with Ingrid Richardson, which was really about thinking about that idea of surveillance as something that really does need to involve care. So rather than it being the opposite to care, when we think about ideas of surveillance, we really need to think about an ethics of care and what that means to watch and to look after, and the kind of politics and power that goes along with that. So I think we were trying to kind of complicate ideas of care and media in that kind of piece.
Yeah, I can follow on from that a bit as well, because I think there is that kind of fine line between, you know, surveillance as care and surveillance as the kind of playing out of a power relationship is really complicated. But I think one of the important things about our work was to demonstrate surveillance as care, actually in action, as something that has kind of emerged from the kinds of caring family relationships that that people are actually living out. So for me, that's really important. It's important, I think, as a way of actually being able to look at surveillance as not just something that, you know, is something that people, because I think we started the project off actually thinking that our participants would be much more worried about members of their family being able to know where they were and know what they were doing. But actually people were happy that somebody knew where they were, because they were going to come and pick them up to take them home, or they were going to, and so, you know, it was really exciting actually seeing that unfold. And I think part of the question was also about kind of taking that on into other projects. So I mentioned before, I'm doing this work about digital social work and child protection social work at the moment. So it's actually really helped me think about the idea of the social worker who is not a family member and is obviously perceived sometimes, you know, as somebody who is in a power relationship, who is performing a mode of surveillance on a family. But actually, it doesn't have to be felt like that and experienced like that. And if you can actually think of ways in which to turn those modes of surveillance and support into modes of digital care as well, then I think that for me, that's an important learning from this project that's kind of I've been able to transfer into helping me to think about other work as well, because I think overturning that basic assumption that surveillance is always bad is just so super important.
If Heather doesn't have anything to add, I might call on Penny, who has a question, and then Svet has a question.
On the same topic about friendly social surveillance, I've just come back from Melbourne. The border opened on Monday and I was there, and now I'm back. And I was really struck by the level at which this idea of friendly surveillance could be taken to the whole of Melbourne. And very divided views on, you know, a lot of people very grateful for the use of police and army and so on in contact tracing and follow up and really ensuring that the rules were enforced. And then, and this is within my own family, others who, you know, it was excessive, it was violent, it was intrusive, it was a step down the road of greater police control and repression. So I think you've addressed it at the sort of family level, but I think that your idea of friendly social surveillance could be scaled up, if you like, to that kind of experience of the pandemic, and how, you know, there was these variety of views on the role of surveillance in keeping the population safe.
That's a fantastic question, Patty. That's absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's interesting when thinking about today, and I was like going back over the material, and I was really thinking about, gosh, that was really present, you know, like this really kind of helped me think through a lot of the stuff that I've been feeling during the pandemic. But it's interesting because also that friendly surveillance concept, we were, so I'm working with a few other colleagues, Ingrid Richardson and Mark Onjevich and Ruth De Silva and Hugh Davies on a project that's looking at covert practice, the pandemic in Melbourne, and the kind of practices that were emerging from that, like things like mask wearing as pro-social rather than anti-social. So, you know, this kind of thing about dobbing in. So suddenly in Australia, it used to be like really anti-Anglo-Australian to dob in a mate. And now it was like all like, yeah, dob in, because this is you're doing the social good. So, and so we ended up doing a survey of 130 people and then in-depth interviews with 28 participants. And it was really about trying to explore some of those textures of surveillance, you know, the textures from those micro-politics of people watching each other in public spaces. You know, like there's this really strange thing now where we're taking masks off and people are kind of smiling at each other because they can see each other's mouths and they kind of don't really know what, you know, it's quite interesting because we've kind of learned all these mechanisms. We've kind of internalized this Foucaultian kind of surveillance thing where we're all trying to do the right thing because we're trying to do that social care piece. And it has really transformed how bodies move in public spaces and how they are watched and cared for. And in the study, one of the things that came out was this real gradation between the federal ideas of surveillance. So the fact that the app was so spectacularly so much of a failure, you know, as opposed to, which was a federal failure, you know, like you can hear the Hawaiian music as that app just kind of floated away. I think they've only been able to pinpoint it to 3 cases that it's, you know, but it's been all the kind of pro-social processes in which, you know, I mean, you've got contact tracing. So this idea that we're all being watched and we're giving numbers and even on little scrappy bits of paper in order to kind of show that we care for each other and that we want to do this together. It is, I mean, I think the whole time when we've been doing the study, I've really been constantly rethinking that friendly surveillance and how it can then filter back into governmental and how we think about governmental notions of surveillance, definitely. Other points from maybe Sydney, from us Sydney people, maybe. So, like,
I don't know, Penny, you can jump in. I mean, I think, well, as someone who's just spent 2 months in the US, where that sort of notion of wearing a mask and doing that, where contact tracing is not even an option, you know, it's and where, you know, it's about personal rights versus personal sort of things. I mean, there you're getting into, I mean, there are really some interesting things about the kind of friendly surveillance and just, you know, privacy sort of things, because basically what's happening is now families have to work out on their own what their norms and rules are and what their sort of, so every, you know, rather than a kind of state level or a kind of we're all in this together kind of ethos, it's very much negotiated with your sort of bubble, with your sort of thing. And well, I don't like to usually give my own anecdotes, but like just this week, you know, my partner is going to go see his parents, and you know, they're starting the process of, you know, isolating, getting COVID tests, doing all the sort of things there. And he and his siblings are working out the norms and rules about what you can do around mom and dad. And they're doing it over WhatsApp and they're doing it over, you know, but it's this kind of thing, and they're pulling out evidence and they're negotiating all of those sort of things. So that's what happens when there isn't that kind of collective project and that collective commitment. And you know, so it is quite interesting, but it's also interesting to watch how it's changing here. So I was noticing in Sydney this last week that that, you know, we didn't have to do the sort of extremes, I don't think, that Melbourne went to, and we still never really had a like public mask mandate in the same way, and haven't had those sort of things. But with the QR codes have been really, really important. And I mean, they're, you know, on all the buildings at my university, basically, you know, you got to log in to get, you know, I have to give people permission to get access into the building. They have to do the QR code when they're here so that they can contact trace. And that's seen there. And people are asking about, you know, kind of what are the rights? How long are you holding on to this information, et cetera. And I'm starting to notice that some of the pubs and bars and stores are saying, we just keep your information for 30 days, because at that point, you know, we pretty much figure that, you know, you're out of the clear, that we won't need to track that. So I'm seeing more of that sort of conscientiousness about that as it becomes a more normative kind of practice to kind of live with the sort of threat of COVID. And, you know, it's still very low levels, very low things compared to what's happening in the US. But yeah, I mean, just from a different sort of thing, but there is that line of the kind of friendly surveillance being, you know, dobbing people in, you know, social media. I know there were some, you know, friends that I had that are in Sydney who, you know, they posted up pictures of them all together, you know, whatever, during, you know, in like July, August. And, you know, it was like, no, don't do that. Like someone will, you know, your immigration status, you know, like, you know, you start thinking about those kinds of dynamics of how quickly those things can kind of move. And the way, and you know, where people are situated, who's going to be the one who gets the fine, who's going to be the one to do that. So that's really sort of random, not very theoretical, but it's a great concept, and it's really great to think of it as, you know, sitting along on a continuum. And I think that's where we are, and even how, you know, something like COVID and stuff changes over time will really make a difference as to where we sit on that. So yeah.
I would just kind of add, I think that, you know, the questions around, you know, digital surveillance kind of emerging from COVID, but also more generally, I think they're just becoming increasingly prominent in so many areas. I mean, they seem to play a part in all of the projects that I'm involved in. And I think there is an awareness as well within organizations that this is an issue. And there are questions around you know, what they see as being transparency, you know, explainability, of actually enabling people to become aware of how they're being monitored. I mean, obviously not all organizations, and I know there's a very critical kind of strand of media studies, which kind of takes those modes of surveillance and kind of the end of its logics, and you know, they are kind of a problematic aspect of capitalism. So there is that layer of it, but I think there's also kind of a need to work with organizations and external partners and stakeholders in these processes, and to actually see how we as social scientists or media humanities and media scholars can actually participate in enabling kind of modes of surveillance to actually be performed in the ways in which we've identified that actually really work in everyday life. And I think that's another aspect of our project that's been really important, that we've shown how, you know, modes of careful and caring surveillance can actually be performed and enacted in ways that really benefit people and make people feel happy and more comfortable in everyday life. So how do we actually engage those insights in our work with external partners and organizations to actually see how that can be taken forward on a different scale and become part of a rather different kind of future society? So I'm being a bit hopeful now.
Could I just add there that another dimension of that is that a lot of this discussion is very politicized, and certainly the whole Melbourne lockdown was highly politicized, and it was either seen as good government or, you know, abysmal government. But in fact, what the concept you're pointing to is political, but it is also looking profoundly at the social as the, you know, the defining, if you like, kind of characteristic. And I think that's also a really important sort of step.
I think a lot of it's about going back to the everyday to understand how things really work and how people create things and systems and processes and what we can actually do with that.
I think Svetlana has been waiting for a little while. Are you still there, Svetlana? Please.
Yes, and no worries. I actually am going to bring the discussion to a bit more lighthearted topic. I was wondering if you've noticed practices of connectivity transform and reconfigure practices of closeness and kinship, and I'm going to give a bit of a personal anecdote because my mother is a migrant, so we have kept in touch very much via, you know, mobile phones, etc. And what I've noticed, and some of my friends noticed with their parents, is that different mobile phone plans that make it cheaper to call certain numbers, for instance, landlines, had changed their practices of keeping in touch with people. So suddenly people who might not have been really close part of the family become very, very, you know, become the people that they keep the most in touch with. For instance, my mother has become really, really close with some neighbors. And I wonder if there is something similar happening with different apps, or like who is possible to connect to and who is not, and then you become kind of the understanding of closeness and kinship kind of shifts a bit.
Oh, sorry, Larissa.
No, you go, Jolynna. You.
I think that, and it actually dovetails back to the conversation that Penny and Jonathan brought up. There tends to be a value within the media literature, at least, that closeness is a good thing. That closeness facilitated by media is positive. And what came out of our study and is situated in other observations of media practices in especially transnational family relationships around issues of cost and access, very broadly the area of scholarship associated with polymedia, so the choices of media and the relationships that they're situated within, is that the availability and the affordability and the extension of the mum in the pocket narrative is that people feel a lot of obligation, as a spectrum of obligation as well as guilt, to respond and to constantly respond when they are checked in on in this sort of friendly surveillance kind of way. And that also extends to the more material digital affordances of Wi-Fi and low cost to just send and forward images. And we saw this quite a bit with some of our transnational families that where the relatives were based in countries like Malaysia, where because you can send an image to everyone in your phone, you should. And whether that's family or friends. And that created some feelings of constant check-in, constant need to respond, and this recreation of community when it's exactly the kinds of claustrophobia of community that people migrated from. So there was that kind of aspect of it. And the second point that I was hoping to make to respond to Penny along the themes that Svetlana brought up is that in the COVID crisis, particularly in Melbourne, that and it was a public health initiative on billboards, you know, are you okay? Ask to check in on friends, ask to check in on family. And especially in the second lockdown where some of the, I mean, this is not part of the study, but being, you know, a good ethnographer, some of the participants in the study are from my extended networks. There was definitely a sense of, can you just leave me alone to get on with this god awful thing? Because I don't want to talk about it. So there, and this is where rethinking some of the key themes of the project, as well as the key methods we used to research the project around tactile and sensory ethnography, circulation of images, circulation of text within family relationships. There's also a very emotional temporal dimension of it's sometimes too much for people to talk, and within families, for family members to talk. It's easy to answer, "I'm fine, please leave me alone," with the emoji. And some of the work that Larissa has done on paralinguistics speaks to this. So those would be how I would respond to the themes that you brought up, Svetlana.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, Jolynna, like I think you've nailed it in terms of that kind of generational performativities that we kind of explored there, that, you know, that like things like, as you were saying, like the paralinguistics, you know, that grandparents tended to use emojis in different ways than grandchildren, and that often, you know, allow for a lot of play in terms of different interpretive toolkits, I suppose. But there was also this thing about like obligation and the kind of what that could entail, and how to kind of offset some of those obligations through various different things. So, you know, particularly for say older adults thinking about their older adults, they would often perform. So Rika, for example, when she's traveling, would often kind of say things that were very much about trying to ease her mother's sense of anxiety, while also trying to ease her own sense of anxiety about not being there. So there's a lot of managing of different, I suppose like affective, what Thomas Lemur might call platformtivities. So the performativities on platforms and how they massaged particular types of feelings and emotions. Yeah.
Well, we can call it an afternoon. Thank you all so very much for sitting in, and it's been really lovely to be able to speak to you about this work that has been some years in the making. We do have one more Media at Sydney seminar, and it's going to be led by our higher degree research candidates, which will be very exciting. They've just had their HDR conference in the last couple of days, and we're going to be having Wayne Hawkins talking about his work with ACAN, so that's and the Australia's communication policy response to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So Wayne is coming to the very end of his PhD, so it'll be a very exciting way to finish the year. So if you're available for that, do please sit in. Otherwise, I think that's it for the afternoon. And thank you all very, very much for joining us.